We are in week 3 of the Mythological Africans Podcast September series on how mythology and folklore and urban legend from the African continent intersects with psychology. In the first episode, which was an introduction to the topic, we established the baseline with an examination of how folk or traditional beliefs form part of the essential framework of the mental architecture of the modern African. In the second episode, we got a bit more specific. My mother, author and poet Suzanne Day, joined me for a conversation about the popular African phenomenon of my village people. And this is the belief that misfortunes in life can result from the malicious intent of one's own village people. The village people in question here, meaning the people who are in your immediate community, so not necessarily a whole village, so to speak. And these are people who might have a vested interest in your success or failure, as the case may very well be. I love that episode for many reasons. First, I got to introduce many of you to one of my favorite people in the world. And we also used a folktale to illustrate the topic, which we talked about, which is not something we've done enough, in my opinion, recently. So that was quite fun. And finally, the episode touched on the heart of one of the main reasons why I curate Mythological Africans. And this is my firm belief in the fact that we African peoples will thrive better when we fully grapple with and resolve the many different and sometimes contradictory aspects of our communities. And we already have our own medicine for how to do this. And what is this medicine? You guessed it, stories. Meaningful, thought-provoking, and conversation-starting stories. And so we move on to yet another phenomenon that is common to the African continent. And this is the case of mass panics, which seem to take a hold of certain communities for days, weeks, or even months at a time. And this is a situation in which, for seemingly irrational reasons, a community concludes that they are under attack by some malevolent entity, with the result being cycles of distress and despair and confusion. Sometimes there are stampedes, which can be quite dangerous, or there are fatal retaliatory attacks. And so in this week's episode, we'll examine some of the folkloric precedents for these events and probe at why certain communities seem so vulnerable to them. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans Podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. Picture this. It's 7:45 p.m. on a Wednesday. Like all students in boarding schools across the West Central African country of Cameroon, you are sitting in class, poring over notes from lessons you attended earlier that day. You might be working on an assignment or passing a note to your best friend while trying to avoid the watchful eyes of whichever teacher or senior student has been assigned to watch your class. Or if you were like me, you are lost in the much more exciting world of a novel carefully hidden within the pages of a physics textbook. The tranquility of the evening is soundtracked with the unrelenting chirp of crickets, the occasional cough or sneeze from a classmate, or the murmur of voices from other students or teachers walking past outside. And then you hear someone cry out, and what feels like a current of electricity courses through the room, and suddenly you're caught up in a stampede of screaming students pushing aside chairs and desks as they try to run outside to safety. You make it to the door, and when you are outside, you look around dazed, your heart racing. And across campus, you see other students pouring out of their classrooms, screaming and scrambling in waves and waves of terror. "What happened?" a fellow student asks frantically. "It was kosh kosh," another student gasps. It takes another half hour and careful, deliberate coordination from teachers for students to return to their classrooms and for things to calm down. But for the rest of the week, the Kosh Kosh visitation is what everyone can talk about, until eventually the event fades away to the realm of memories. That is until it happens again. Kosh Kosh is a ghostly apparition, an urban legend from the African continent. She is one of the most well-known to students of mostly girls' boarding schools across much of English-speaking African countries. In Cameroon, where I'm from, we know her as Kosh Kosh. In Nigeria, she is Madame Koi Koi. In Ghana, she is Lady Moke or Lady Koi Koi. And in South Africa, my understanding is that she is Pinky Pinky. Her story is quite similar across West Africa. She is a teacher who haunts dormitories, announcing her arrival with the distinct click of her red high heels, hence the name Kosh Kosh or Koi Koi. The South African version differs slightly. Pinky Pinky doesn't wear high heels, at least to my knowledge. She does, however, have a penchant for adopting schoolgirls from toilets. Where this apparition comes from and why she terrorizes students is the stuff of legend. The story seems to change with each telling, but the general theme is that she was a teacher known for her stylish clothes and signature red high-heeled shoes. She was also known to be really cruel to her students. So cruel, in fact, that in some versions she's fired for beating a student. To add insult to injury, she also dies in a car accident on her way home after being fired. And this is all too much for the conceited woman who decides to haunt the students of the school forever. In another version of her story, she is so cruel, a group of students take matters into their own hands to gang up on her and beat her to death, leaving behind an angry, vengeful ghost. Whatever the case may be, in Cameroon where I went to school, Kosh Kosh's appearance almost always triggered cycles of mass panic, which would have students pouring out of their classrooms or dormitories in terrified waves day after day or week after week, sometimes even spreading from school to school. This is not the only instance when a creature of myth and legend causes mass panic on the continent. In Zanzibar, along the East African coast, another creature, the Popobawa, is known to trigger mass panic. The name Popobawa comes from the merging of two Swahili words, Popo, which means bat, and Bawa, which means wing. And this description alludes to the shape of the shadow cast by the creature. By some accounts, it's a bat-shaped creature with one eye, and it looks quite terrifying. Popobawas themselves can take different forms. They are shapeshifters. And they attack communities. No one is safe. Not men, not women, not children. In Zanzibari law, they are said to have been created by a sheikh, who is a Muslim chief or king or leader of some kind. And this sheikh summoned the first Popobawa to attack a neighbor he was on bad terms with. But then he lost control of the creature. And so it went on to attack communities and multiply itself, and so the story goes. Descriptions of Popobawas, however, make them out to be the classic instance of sleep paralysis. And this is because victims say Popobawas squeeze their rib cages, cutting off their breath, filling them with extreme terror and leaving them unable to move or speak. But in the lore, however, the Popobawas' most feared means of attack is sexual assault. And what's worse, they insist that their victims tell others of the attack, threatening further attacks if they do not comply. Across the islands of Zanzibar, news of Popobawa attacks leave communities in a state of heaving fright and despair. Night after night, families congregate outside fires, too afraid to sleep in their own homes. In 1995, there was a mass panic related to Popobawa attacks, and as the phenomenon spread, crowds started attacking and even killing individuals they believed to be manifestations of Popobawa. This creature is a fairly recent arrival to the island of Zanzibar. Its existence was first documented in the 1960s during a time of political upheaval in Tanzania and on the island where the phenomenon most often shows up. And In the 1995 case is interesting, however, because during that time, Martin Walsh, who's a British social anthropologist, happened to be in Zanzibar during the month-long panic. And so he spent time studying and documenting the phenomenon and has produced some really great work on the topic. And as usual, you can check the episode notes if you want to know more. So we have the Kosh Kosh and Popo Bawa, two very different creatures, both fairly recent introductions to the continent, because you have to remember Kosh Kosh is associated with girls' boarding schools, which didn't show up until missionaries and colonization and all of that. And then you have Popo Bawa, which is in the 60s, in that time of decolonization that swept across the continent. And both are responsible for widespread mass panic events. So what is going on here? Why is this the case? On the surface, the explanation seems simple enough. It's a frightful creature that triggers fright-filled reactions, and that's what it is. But there is something else at work here. This effect of contagion, so it starts somewhere and then it spreads and multiplies itself. And this has happened in other less frightening contexts. For example, in 1962, there was an epidemic of laughter, which spread from a girls' boarding school, there it is again, a girls' boarding school, near Kashasha village in Tanzania, to schools and communities in the surrounding area. And the whole episode unfolded over the course of 18 months, at the end of which up to 1,000 people were affected. By the way, the laughter was just one dimension of this epidemic. There were reports of crying and restlessness and pain and fainting, respiratory problems and rashes. And as recently as 2023, an outbreak of rapid and involuntary arm and leg movements, coupled with headaches and vertigo, resulted in the hospitalization of over 100 students from St. Teresa's Egregre Girls High School in Musoli, Kenya. There it is again, a school. All of these cases that I've just described, and in many others that or you might have experienced if you live on the African continent or anywhere else in the world, because these things have been documented all over the world, are cases of what is known as a mass panic or a mass psychogenic or sociogenic disorder. And this is a phenomenon in which vulnerable people, usually students, usually younger female students, experience unexplained outbreaks of subjective somatic complaints that seem to have no logical explanation, not physical, not biological or etiological. There is no reason why people are experiencing these symptoms, unless you look below the surface. Mass panic events are believed to be caused by stress and anxiety resulting from the perception of a threat. And it's a complex biopsychosocial phenomenon which is triggered in different contexts, often in concert with concerns about supernatural influences, medical emergencies, social, political, or religious crises, and such things. And as I just mentioned, mass panic events have been recorded all across the world. In schools, in villages, in homes, in offices. It happens among healthy and otherwise perfectly functional people. But again, really very common among adolescent or pre-adolescent girls. And what's interesting is that it spreads through visual or auditory contact. So it can reoccur if the original circumstances under which the first case happened is duplicated or reestablished. So you think about it. You have a situation where a student in a boarding school experiences one of these things and triggers a cycle, and then everything calms down, basically resetting to the original circumstances, and then it happens again. And let me give a bit of context here. I was born and raised in Cameroon. I did 7 years in Cameroonian boarding schools. And what tends to happen is that these schools were established by missionaries, so Catholic, Baptist, Presbyterian missionaries most likely. So these schools are organized around the spiritual philosophies of these denominations. So if you're Catholic, you do Mass and the religious observances of Catholics, ditto Baptist or Presbyterian. And these schools are intended not just for academic formation, they're also intended as spiritual formation. So you grow up really immersed in this academic, scholarly, and religious climate. And it's a very regimented life. For 7 years, you wake up at 5 a.m. usually, and you go take a bath, you have a chore that you do, cleaning some part of campus. You go to breakfast, which is usually tied with morning devotions or mass, and then you go to class, you have a break, you go back to class, you have lunch, you go for siesta, or if you are at a certain level, you might need to go back to class. And then in the evening, you go back to class again for study time. So it's a very regimented experience. And when it's almost time for exams, there's a lot of tension that builds up. And all of this with the normal hormonal changes that you would experience as a teenager or as an adolescent, friendship crisis, identity crisis. So it can be a very intense environment to be in. And it doesn't take much to trigger events such as this. So in the case of Kosh Kosh and the Popobawa, the phenomenon has been tied to creatures of urban legend or folklore. But the conditions under which they arrive, like I said, suggest that they are examples of mass panic which have just been associated with these creatures. And I especially think about the Popobawa panic, which occurred in 1995. And what's interesting about 1995 is that it's the year Tanzania had a general elections. And it also coincided with the time of Ramadan. And this is the time during which Muslims, who comprise a significant number of Zanzibar's population, fast and pray. So you have political pressure, you have people not eating at their usual speed, you have this specter of, political anxiety and also religious intensity, perfect conditions for a mass panic event to unfold. And across the continent, at different scales, there are similar cases of mass panic inspired by the unfortunate coincidence of political or social circumstances and folk beliefs. And these have caused, sometimes significant harm to people from vulnerable groups, whether they are older women or children branded as witches and ostracized, or people with disabilities attacked under mistaken assumptions of their culpability or involvement in nefarious events. There are theories out there that in the period of colonization and in decolonization, a lot of what is now showing up as dysfunction in the understanding of African traditions and cultures emerged during that time because people were under tremendous psychological and cultural stress. And this manifested in people basically seeing a boogeyman in just about every corner. And so what does this mean for us, right? What do we do with this kind of information? To me, primarily, it's about awareness. These mass panic events are not without casualties, right? So they are neat stories that we tell, boarding school memories. Kosh Kosh or Madame Koi Koi, for example, has made it into popular culture, short stories, films on Netflix, etc. But in reality, these phenomena have actual implications for people's lives. And so I believe that the more aware we are of why they occur, the conditions under which they occur, the better equipped we are to deal with them when they do occur. And this is especially important for communities where people incorporate supernatural phenomena into their model of how the world works. It's critically important that we understand the patterns of generation, manifestation, and replication of such phenomena so we can protect ourselves from them, but also from bad actors who we always know are waiting in the wings to take advantage of such situations. And so we'll stop here for now, but come back next week for more on the way folk beliefs and urban legends inform social and psychological phenomena across the African continent. Thank you, as always, for listening.